According to Sun Ra, none of us are real. Though sympathetic, the judge ruled that Blount, aka Sun Ra, was violating the law and was at risk for being drafted into the U.S. military. Blount responded that if inducted, he would use military weapons and training to kill the first high-ranking military officer he could find. The judge sentenced Blount to jail, pending draft board and CPS rulings, and then said, "I have never seen a nigger like you before." Blount replied, "No, and you never will again." 1. Witnessed during the time just before dawn. Dark bodies overlap with the Atlantic, always lapping at our shores, of water, of sky, of flesh. Imagine simultaneous teeth grinding, each and every one of us having the same dream at the same moment on the same night. That's what it's like to wake up forgetting something that you've never known in the first place. Upon waking, our sharpest tools begin to dull as the light of day demands legibility and translation. Switch. Code. Switch, switch. 2. Scientific knowledge. Salinity, dense enough to float a thick-thighed body. Temperature, warm enough to swim at night in August. Depth, everything is in here. Yes, everything. Flora, entire forests and vast decaying cities that can only be seen in dreams. Fauna, when the stars are out, they're reflected in dark water. One particular ocean-dwelling species is capable of outlasting all the rest by drinking the starlight as it's filtered through the fast-moving glassy surface of the water. That substance, fortified and metabolized during sleep, allows the species to see itself clearly for fleeting moments of ecstatic frustration. 3. Journeying to space above, space below. Black people need scuba gear to breathe on land. 4. Trajectories, melancholy, hopeful, and otherwise. Sun Ra was sent to prison for refusing to go to war and for being a smart, weird, piano-playing faggot. While there, psychiatrists diagnosed him as being a smart, weird, piano-playing faggot. While there, psychiatrists diagnosed him as being a smart, weird, piano-playing faggot. When he left prison and moved to Chicago, he continued to be a smart, weird, piano-playing faggot. When he began to write the strangest and most beautiful music, he did it as a smart, weird, piano-playing faggot. When he lived in Oakland and then New York, consorting with various black nationalist organizations, he remained a smart, weird, piano-playing faggot. And after deciding that he no longer identified with any particular race or creed, but rather sought transcendence to another plane of existence, he just kept right on being a smart, weird, piano-playing faggot. Sun Ra became a fixture in Philadelphia in the 1980s, where he started to become an old, smart, weird, piano-playing faggot, And when he had a stroke in 1990, he kept composing and playing like the smart, weird piano playing faggot that he was. When Sun Ra opened for Sonic Youth for a few shows in the early 1990s, he was most certainly a smart, weird piano playing faggot. And when he went home to Birmingham, Alabama to see his sister estranged after 40 years, caught pneumonia, and died there in 1993, he had most absolutely returned to the earth from which he came as a smart, weird piano playing faggot. 5. This salty body breathes fervently.
Through my grubby hands. I'm very pleased to welcome a person that I've known for a very long time and a person that I've just met. This is Taylor Ho Bynum and Naima Lowe. Both were contributors to Sound American 24. Taylor has been a contributor to Sound American a number of times and is on our advisory board and is a long-term friend of mine and a brilliant composer and cornetist. Naima, this is her first time contributing to Sound American. She's an incredible poet. Her piece is one of my favorites. Actually, both their pieces are two of the most radical things we've ever put out. As far as we've never put out anything that's narrative. We've rarely put out poetry. So it was really exciting for me to have both of your contributions. Just a quick rundown of how this is going to work, because this will be the first roundtable of the evening, I've put together 2 questions about Sun Ra that I'm going to ask all of our contributors tonight. This is following in a tradition that we've had since the What is Jazz issue, which is issue 8, I believe, and asking a lot of different people the same questions in hopes of kind of weaving a tapestry of opinions. So we're going to do that tonight. And the first question comes kind of from my own understanding of Sun Ra. I've always seen Sun Ra as one of these American iconoclasts. I call them the great American weirdos, in a loving way that isn't always taken by the living examples of American weirdos when I call them that. But it's kind of this certain kind of American iconoclasm, especially in music and writing and drama and dance, that can't be found really anywhere else. I think Sun Ra is an incredible example of that, but also Duke Ellington, Charles Bukowski, in a way Susan Sontag, Pauline Oliveros, Harry Parch, people that just not only played by the beat of their own drummer, but no one has ever really figured out how to find that beat themselves. They are one of a kind. And so I want to start from that position. And the first question is, what do you think Sun Ra has added to the American, not only musical culture, but just our general culture? What does he represent? What do you think he changed? And Taylor, I want to start asking you, because I think your story in the issue, My Teacher's Teacher, like directly addresses that thing of what does a very special personality add to a culture even long after they're gone, and we're dealing generations removed from their original work.
Great. Thank you, Nate and Naima. So happy to be on this discussion with you. I think I would start by saying we're America being a very young country, but in our very young life, we have managed to accumulate a huge amount of myth. And a lot of that myth is sort of hierarchical, coming from the powers that be to tell us what our American myths are. Mm-hmm. And what I think is beautiful about Sun Ra is he subverted that and said, no, those myths are bullshit. I'm going to give you myth. And I think myths that for me are both truer and will last more, while also being more magical and more beautiful and more fictive. But by almost embracing that explicitly, he was able to create, just sort of say, any of us can create our myth. That's the thing that's good about this place. There's a lot of bullshit about this place, but we can fight for our own story. And I think he did that in such an extraordinary, in such a powerful way. For me, Sun Ra always just, the world doesn't make sense, and the world didn't make sense to him. So he's like, this world doesn't make sense. I'm from another world. And there's something profoundly radical about that. And he did it to an extent and a depth that I think few other figures in American culture have.
How about you, Naima?
Well, it's funny, as you were talking about him and his sort of like singularity and about iconoclasm, I think about the way that I sort of have come to Sun Ra. The poem that I included in the issue is sort of about, it's part of a larger collection that I've been working on for a long time that's called Strange Old Black Men I Have Known and Loved. And it's like sort of homages to both like people that I have actual personal relationships and various sort of big cultural figures. And one of the sort of places that I go when I think about that sort of collection of work, and I think about the connections between some of these different figures, is like, to me, when I came to Sun Ra, I'm a visual artist, I'm a writer, I think I saw Space is the Place before I'd heard any music or kind of had a concept, right? So I'm thinking of this like sort of totality of weirdness kind of happening, and how there's a part of it that is like wild style, right? Like looking at that film, but then there's also the part of it that's deeply familiar to me, like both musically in terms of some of the musics that I, sort of grew up listening to and being around, but also that as out there as he was, a weird, kind of femmy, slightly cult leadery genius art black dude, like in Chicago or Philly in the 70s, 80s, is actually not that strange. Like it's strange, but it's not that strange. And I grew up in a cultural milieu where like a weirdo talk about being from outer space as like a way to manage how sad and difficult the world is, again, in the context of, Afrocentrism and Black liberation, in those places in the world is not that unusual, right? Like he came out of a very specific place, and I think I actually kind of resist. Part of my thinking is like sort of resisting the idea. Actually, I mean, like not to resist his singular genius, but in some ways, kind of to resist singular genius. I'm a daughter of a jazz musician. That gets really boring and misogynistic to me at a certain point. Like, but also, to me, the resuscitation of that isn't so much to like dismiss the creativity and the beauty of what he's done, but rather to resituate him within a specific culture that actually produced him, and that he had a complicated relationship to, but was in relationship to, rather than sort of, and also, again, as a visual artist, like there's a moment right now where like there's all these like particularly white, although not just white, like visual artists like know fuck all about jazz from a like cultural context, but they know Sun Ra, right? And they get very excited. So he's like sort of like this cachet, and they're even further like taking him out of, and they're like, whoa, somebody who was talking about going to outer space. And I'm like, come on, have you been to South Trenton, New Jersey? Like this is, I mean, you know what I'm saying? This is like straight up like slightly gay Nation of Islam shit, right? Like the idea of Black people inventing other worlds in order to make sense of our world is nothing new. He's from a tradition. He's from, so for me, I think his uniqueness is maybe a function of like the ways that he takes these things that I think are very much of a lot of complex, interconnected sort of cultural realities, and made a kind of, I don't know, more interdisciplinary vision out of it, right? And a vision that could touch more than one community because it spoke so many languages, right? Because it spoke visual languages, and because it spoke poetic languages, and because it spoke musical languages. And so people kind of had this access in a way that some of his peers in music, as well as in, other kind of cultural forms, maybe didn't have the same, I don't know, sort of trickstery fluency with. So like being in costume and being like having that kind of visual awareness in a very particular way, I feel like that feels really sort of different and separate. But even then, I'm still inclined to be like, but that also, a weird old Black dude wearing a robe, walking down the street that he made out of some stuff we found from, and I was like, again, have you been to Philadelphia, right?
And I'm glad, I think both Nate, one of the reasons I'm glad you did this issue, and Naima, one of the things I appreciated about your piece, and one of the things I was trying to get to in my piece as well, there's always the worry when people you've long admired become sort of like hashtags in this moment. And I think there is this sort of Afrofuturism trendiness, and there is this kind of Sun Ra trendiness that for me, unfortunately flattens what he is into this sort of easily commodifiable, easily definable little thing. Oh, he was that crazy Black guy who talked about space and blah, 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 and now he'll open for Solange or whatever, or his ghost band will open, and that's cool. That's great that that's happening. But at the same time, the worry is always so much, as Naima was just discussing, like so much historical context, so much part of the tradition that he actually did exist within, so much of the contradictions, and there's parts of Sun Ra's thing that we need to critique that were troublesome, and making him into kind of an easy to swallow hero or easy to swallow kind of cult figure, for me, really misses the point of it. And I don't think, I mean, as much as he enjoyed having his cult and leading it the way he led it and being a strong leader, which he did talk about a disturbingly large amount, I don't think he wanted it. He was always, he was, as Naima said, he was a trickster. I don't think he wanted to be able to be defined. He spent his whole career resisting definition. And I really think it's imperative that we work to respect the complications and complexity of him and his work and his image, and as opposed to accept what's becoming increasingly sort of a short entry, a sort of easily definable version of Sun Ra. You know, like, let's keep him weird and magical and amazing, right, and part of this deep cultural history, and queer and misogynistic and culty and dictatorial and brilliant, and all those things can exist together. They're not mutually exclusive, and in fact, they're actually all the more inspiring and powerful when we recognize that they aren't mutually exclusive.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, you both have kind of already answered my second question, which was the opposite of that. How do you think that the America that he grew up in made Sun Ra? You know, and Naima, you kind of answered it. It's like, it made Sun Ra, but it also, like, have you been to Philly? That's a broader question. Like, how does that middle, early 20th century through now continuing affect that culture? How does it create someone like Sun Ra? And to Taylor's point, like, even after his death, it's still affecting him in that it's created a commodity. You know, that's what America does best, is commodifies. And it has created a commodity out of this person who is very particular. This was a thought that I had, especially reading your poem, Naima, because it was the first time that I finally could articulate, like, yeah, there's an idea of singularity coming out of America that's a positive thing, but how does, especially the negativities of the culture, some of the positive effects, of course, but like a lot of the negative effects, create something that's different? And how do you think that affected him? How do you, or in the broader, you know, if there are guys walking around in robes, and there are in my neighborhood, like, where do you think that effect comes from? And what made Sun Ra different? And, you know, I think Taylor's already kind of eloquently put it, like, what do we need to do to keep him? Welcome to Brooklyn.
Sonny's telling you something, man.
What do we need to do to keep him from becoming a commodity? You know, to keep that American influence in a positive way, if we can, you know, or just get rid of it altogether.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it's interesting, right? Again, I think about him, and through the lens of sort of like visual artists, media studies and stuff. And, you know, he, among many other things, created images, right? And images, especially in this moment, that have, you know, images can become really promiscuous, right? They get around. And that can be really problematic, but that can also be kind of this exciting infection, right? Like, yeah, he's memed. He's everywhere. Yeah. And that's challenging, but it also means there's like newer generations of people who access him who wouldn't otherwise. And that also is exciting. Yeah. So I tend to sort of resist kind of the either or of even engaging around the question of like commodity. It's like, is he a commodity? Yeah, so. Is he not? Yeah, so. You know, like, not to say that that doesn't have an impact on people's like livelihood, careers, like the economics of this. I'm not trying to make that case, but I also feel like part of his brilliance in terms of creating very specific spectacle was sort of saying like, it's going to happen anyway, so might as well do it. And that part of what's come after that is this kind of, you know, like I said, these very promiscuous images, both of him and then of his kind of image to others. So that's one thing. But to answer your question around like his moment and how that influenced him, one of the in my research for the work I've been doing and for that poem and stuff, I came upon this lecture that he gave when he was like on the faculty at UC Berkeley in the 70s, right? And it's like exactly what you would think a lecture by Sun Ra for a college class would be. It's just that it kind of is like long and meandering and hilarious and like almost makes sense. And you're like following until you're like, oh, I have no idea, and like and he's like ribbing people, and then he like brings it back around, and then there's like a lot of sort of sensical references to Egypt, whatever, right? Like it's exactly what you think. But it also he's doing a lot of storytelling, and one of the stories that are the most cogent in it are basically stories of aloneness, right? He tells these two stories that really stick out. It's a story of this there's this man, he's on the street, he's struggling, and he's angry in his struggle, and everyone ignores him, and he's just angry and struggling. And then this black woman comes to him and offers to help him. And because everyone has been so cruel and dismissive to him for so long, he doesn't know how to accept her love, right? And they're both these people, the person who needs this love, the person who's trying to share this love, are just so incredibly sad. Yeah. And to me, the fact that that moment was probably some of the most cogent of this whole lecture is really telling and really crafty, right? Which is that like at a core level, when he gets to the end of the lecture, he talks about the value of interdependence and why we all need to do a better job of trying to like lift up and support those of us who struggle, right? And not just sort of create a vision of like the right kind of blackness versus the person who is weak and is struggling and is strange. And I just, it really moved me and made me really go back and think about the melancholy that lives in so much of what he does, and that combination of melancholy and humor that is so inside so much Black expression, like sort of by definition, was really telling and beautiful. And I think, that's what I came at. I was like, oh, it is hard to be you, right? And you've done a bunch of work to try to make it possible, but it is hard. And I think that was where he came from. I think it is where he ended up. And I think it's where a lot of us continue to be. I think that's how I would answer that question, is that like that melancholy or that like gallows humor, attached to melancholy, is so kind of like essential to understanding and actually understanding like what he was doing.
Taylor?
That was beautiful. Amen.
Yeah.
The only thing I would just quickly add is I think a lot of us that are often frustrated or angry at America as a concept or a nation or a system built on slavery and genocide and capitalism and oppression. Sometimes say, well, but it produced Sun Ra, it produced Duke Ellington, it produced, Harry Partch, it produced Pauline Oliveros, it produced these weirdos, it produced these eccentrics, it produced this beautiful art and this beautiful work. I have to admit, there's recent, and this is like the other day, I was talking to one of my students, and I shouldn't depress my students this way, but I was like, I'm not even sure Duke Ellington makes this shit worth it. And that was like a hard sentence for me to say.
Yeah.
I didn't say he does, but like at least, and that's I think our contradiction, and it's not just America. I mean, you could say that's the human species post the, ever since we, started the agrarian revolution and the industrial revolution, that started assembling in large hierarchical organized groups that crush each other. So like, that was sort of my question was, can these kind of figures exist in more positive places? For me, that was one of the reasons I wrote that story, was just imagining, could you still have work that melancholy with that, all of those energies and all of that anger and all of that beauty in a simpler time? Would you need it? Would the simpler music be beautiful? Would it just be like birdsong? I don't know. I don't know that answer. And I don't necessarily want to find out, because that means that, we collapse as a society. And like, while that might be morally or environmentally or philosophically necessary, I don't necessarily want to have it happen while I'm here. But it's a sort of an impossible question, but I do think, and it's a very American question, but I do think it quickly kind of transcends that to a very human question. Like, if those struggles make more powerful art, but why are humans struggling like that? Why does someone as smart and as brilliant as Sun Ra end up being so lonely and being so and having that, I don't know, but that's what we fight for and what we talk about and why we are inspired by him.
Yeah. I think that I'm going to wrap it up now. Thank you both. This is Taylor Ho Bynum, Naima Lowe. Both are contributors to Sound American 24, which you can read online at soundamerican.org or purchase through the Bandcamp page or through soundamerican.org. Please look in the comments for links, not only to do that, but to make your suggested $10 donation. Again, that money is going to Nation Inside Justice for Families Project, which works to reallocate funding away from mass incarceration and towards projects for families and communities of color. Thank you both, not only for playing and reading and speaking with me, but for taking the time to write beautiful pieces for the journal. This is a really special one for me, and to have you both involved meant a lot. So
thanks for making it happen, man.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll see you both in person at some point before I die. All right. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey everybody, John Corbett here. Very, very honored to be part of the launch of Sound American's Sun Ra issue. I'm going to read a short excerpt from a Sun Ra piece in my book, Pick Up the Pieces, Excursions in 70s Music. Some artists have a fraught relationship to their time. Sun Ra's position was more extreme. He was an outright enemy of time. Ra resisted the human imperative to expire. Choose life, not death, he once titled an essay. And he memorably titled a piece, It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? At the beginning of the semi-autobiographical film, Space is the Place, he eagerly anticipated a moment when people would, quote, consider time officially ended. He was, quite literally, looking forward to the end of time. A musician like this, as you can imagine, might have a complicated feeling about his own place in history. The last time I spoke with Sun Ra, I asked him for his take on the enduring legacy of the Great American Songbook. It was 1993. Ra had returned to Birmingham, Alabama, where he'd been born nearly 80 years prior. He would die there from complications associated with pneumonia a few weeks later. The pianist, composer, and band leader's first published composition, Alone with Just a Memory of You, written in 1936 together with one Henry McKellen's, conveyed a tender, awkward, Tin Pan Alley tone that betrayed his love of sentimental songcraft. This passion is driven home repeatedly in a survey of Ra's magnificently gigantic discography. He employed anachronistic singers like Clyde Williams and Hattie Randolph. He played familiar compositions with double entendre titles meaningful to him, such as East of the Sun, Keep Your Sunny Side Up, I Dream Too Much, and Over the Rainbow. Never mind that Ra is known to many as one of the most adventurous and innovative figures in the history of 20th century. that he brought synthesizers to jazz, that his costumes and light shows paved the way for psychedelic rock, that he wrote apocalyptic and deeply philosophical poetry, that he identified as extraterrestrial. Ra couldn't resist a good song. His reply to my question was typically elliptical, asking me to consider his interest in comic books. The reason he read comics, especially when he was a young musician, he said, was that the artists that made them worked within a set format and had crazy deadlines, which meant that they had to be creative under pressure. They didn't have the luxury of time. The great ones rose out of a homogenizing environment, and the individual spark ignited by their work happened in such a strict context that its genius was undeniable. Like Jerome Kern, the Gershwins, and Cole Porter, comic book artists had expressed their ingenuity in an especially claustrophobic and constraining genre, the popular Broadway show tune. It's after midnight at the Zigzag Tavern, so named for its staggered stage shows and the way its leering clientele darts between them. The year is 1951. The town is Calumet City, Illinois. Sun Ra is at the piano, right hand playing a bluesy ostinato, left hand leaving the keyboard for a moment to flip the pages of Schopenhauer's On the Freedom of the Will, propped up on the piano lid. There's a chorus of whoops and hollers from the other side of the white sheet behind which he and his bandmates are hidden. Ra recognizes the cue and begins a volume swell. One by one, articles of women's clothing are tossed into the air, appearing for a flash above the white curtain. Ra nods at drummer Tommy Bugs Hunter, who winds up and begins to deliver a bump and grind beat, tenor saxophonist Red Holloway ladling on some extra groove juice. They've been back there since 6 o'clock, and we will be there until the other 6 o'clock. His accomplices have been relieved at intervals by other musicians, but not Ra. He will play behind the strippers, various MCs, an occasional comedian through the night. The piece is finished, panties finally flung high, accompanied by wolfish sounds, and now the pianist is up, adjusting his tape recorder, changing the reel, and waiting for the next girl to hit the stage. He's closed Schopenhauer and opened the latest edition of John Carter of Mars, a comic book modeled on Buck Rogers. For the rest of the night, when he's not eating a sandwich from the bar or running back and forth to the toilet, Ra will read and record and perform, an automatic multitasker. Ra played at strip clubs and speakeasies in Calumet City in the 40s and early 50s. With hundreds of bars and dozens of clubs, all controlled by the mafia, Calumet City's State Street was known nationwide as Sin Strip, a simmering destination with a semi-legit facade and a bad reputation that attracted visitors from Chicago, 20 miles north and beyond. It was also a popular spot for musicians from the Windy City, like Ra, who went there looking for work outside the union and for payment under the table. The labor was not lucrative, but if you wanted it, with so many clubs, it was plentiful. And as Ra told Dave Hoekstra in 1987, all they wanted you to do was swing. He added, some of the best drummers played the street. The strippers always had to have a good drummer for their bumps, you know. Alton Abraham, who was Ra's manager and closest advisor through the Chicago years and into the 1960s, told me that Calumet City gigs were incredibly rough, especially for Black musicians. Robert Berry, who drummed with Ra in many of these strip clubs, confirmed this, saying that along with the dangers of gambling misunderstandings and drunken fights, there were other perils. The club owners were mob connected. Some of the understaffed police department were on the take, and there was a sense of self-rule to the nightlife. Barry saw two men beaten to death with metal pipes for not paying their bar tab, and he watched as a fellow musician was thrown through a plate glass window for messing with the strippers. Knives were common. Guns were not unfamiliar. It was a classic, wide-open town. Thanks.
I am here with Ken Vandermark and John Corbett, two people that I have known for a long time, respected for a long time, and continue to respect. Ken is on our advisory board and has been a contributor to past issues. The one that I remember the best is his conversation with Joe Morris in our What is Jazz issue 8. John Corbett has been a friend of Sound American forever. This is the first time that we're featuring his writing, and we're really excited to have you both here. Thanks for showing up, thanks for giving us your writing, and thanks for playing and reading.
Yeah, beautiful.
Pleasure. Thanks, man.
I'm just going to jump in with our first question. I have been asking people kind of roughly the same questions across the 3 parts of tonight's event. And I'd like to kind of start by aiming this question at John, because I think there's some of your writing from your book Vinyl Freak that we excerpted in this issue that speaks to the cultural weight of Sun Ra as an icon, not just musically, but as a product of his time, as a visual component of of the mainstream. One of the few people besides maybe Coltrane and Miles Davis, Louis Armstrong, that is recognizable in the mainstream, especially in Chicago. I mean, I've gone to McDonald's where they're playing Sun Ra in Chicago. But your piece talks a lot about saving the history in objects of Sun Ra's legacy. And my first question is kind of what do you think, how do you think Sun Ra's just existing in the world changed the pathway that led to American culture? In other words, kind of like we know how John Cage had an effect on American musical culture. I would argue that Sun Ra had an impact on musical culture, but also on arts culture, on Afrofuturism, a lot of these things that move beyond music. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what you think his kind of legacy is in how we view American culture now.
Yeah, that's a that's a complicated question, and it depends. I think it's changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years. Ra was looking for a global platform for what he was doing, and trying to find a way to have the biggest possible way of broadcasting, not just the music, but all of the other aspects. I mean, he related all of the things that he was doing to music. So he saw them all as being part of music. So we can just say his music, but we mean his philosophy, we mean his poetry, we mean the costumes and the backdrops and all of the things that he did and he promoted and that he assembled out of a quite disparate group of artists coming together and making the Sun Ra kind of juggernaut. He wanted the biggest possible platform, and that was almost possible in the mid-1970s when he got this big deal with ABC Impulse. But that deal went south really quickly. And I think it would have been, that was the beginning of what might have been an even bigger presence for him in the 1970s and 80s, in a way that might have made him that much more of a cultural icon in his own lifetime. I mean, he was in a way, but he certainly is much more now. And I think part of the reason that he is now is, as is often the most surefire way for somebody to have a lasting presence, it's artists, it's musicians themselves who have actually taken him on as that icon. It's not presence on the cover of Time magazine. It's not presence on television. It's not those things that have an ephemeral kind of flash in the pan element. It's the fact that he's become part of the lingua franca of today's visual arts community, Afrofuturism community, and of course, music communities outside of the jazz and creative music communities. I mean, he's somebody who's he's somebody you have to grapple with as a composer, no matter where you come from on the spectrum. So I think it's multi-part, and I think it's important to sort of see it not only as, not to imagine it as something that was complete in his lifetime. It's something that's actually been growing since then. And it's hard to characterize, but I would just say that I think it's this multi-level aspect that he was always attentive to. That's one of the hallmarks of it, that the orchestra for him was really much more than a band. It was a whole way of thinking.
I think in that kind of, to take off on what John said about artists taking Sun Ra and keeping that spirit alive, but also making him the presence that he is today. Ken, in your piece, you talk a lot about kind of the musical connections between him and Ellington, but the part that was most interesting to me was you were talking about the DIY elements that are continuous between the two. I've always kind of put Sun Ra in that same place as Harry Parch, in that they had a really radical vision and they just figured out a way to do it. At a time that they didn't have Bandcamp, they didn't have SoundCloud, all these ways that make it easy to do that. They were doing it the hard way. And everybody that is involved in tonight's event, I've noticed, also has that part of their personality. And I don't know if it comes from it's a product of their attraction to Sun Ra or not, but with catalytic sound, a lot of the work you're doing with audiographic, you had a huge festival last week. There are elements musically and kind of, I feel like, in your practice, your economic practice, if we want to call it that seem to come from Sun Ra. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of take the same question that John so eloquently answered, socially and talk about kind of from the artistic and economic side what you think Sun Ra has brought to the time we're living in now.
Well, I would definitely put Ra in the category of a forerunner to owning your own work. I mean, the fact that he started a record label and ran a record label as an independent artist from very, very early, like the beginning of his career as Sun Ra, that sets a precedent that everybody's going to follow. You know what I mean? And to be a Black American artist doing that, you know, starting in the late 50s, I mean, that's like I can't even wrap my head around how huge a paradigm shift that is. And, you know, having models like that is an enabler. You know, like I don't have to make up the idea. It's been developed before me at an incredibly high level. You know, the fact that he was making LPs and often creating record covers for them, you know, hand painting them with the band, and then, you know, they're not even dry yet and they're at the shows. I mean, he was doing stuff that people now are doing with Bandcamp, but using technology and possibilities of his time. And so there's no question that impact of DIY, do it yourself, be in control, be self-defining, like all of those things that I admire and I strive for in my own work. He's a model for that. And like not, well, it's a nice attempt. It's like fully realized. I mean, what John said about the orchestra being much more than a band. I mean, Ra's whole universe connected to music is definitely one of the highest versions of what you can accomplish on a multi-layered way. Like, I work as a musician. I'm fascinated by things connected to music. I love art. Fundamentally, what I make is music, and I want to control as much of that as I possibly can. So I have a record label. I'm interested in other arts. I like photography. But Sun Ra, I mean, I mean, what didn't he do? You know what I mean? Like his accomplishment as a musician, artist, poet, philosopher, business person. I mean, you just go down the list, and he nailed it. As a Black American in a context that was totally against any possibility of what he accomplished. I mean, just doing what he did, accomplished in a utopian situation would already be a frigging miracle, you know? And 1958 Chicago, United States was not utopia, and it's certainly not utopia now. For him to work through all that and accomplish that, man, I mean, like, I can't really express the level of admiration and inspiration that comes from that source as an artist trying to work today in 2020.
And I think that kind of takes me, go ahead, John.
I was just going to tag on to that to say, you know, he's well known for having frequently talked about the fact that the possible has always been done. It's important for us to attempt the impossible.
Yeah.
And he told me, I love that. One of the interviews that I did with him, he said, I love doing that because if I attempt the impossible and I'm successful, I know I'm not bullshitting, which is a great idea. But what's the impossible in the context that he comes up? Having a big band.
Yeah.
Having a large ensemble and moving it around the country and moving it around the world.
Yeah.
And playing at that time, it was impossible by then, right? Like, it had become completely impossible. What are the big bands that are playing at that? Everybody's scaled down. Everybody's playing kind of, you know, quartets, quintets, trios. And here he is still working with a 30-plus band, you know. That's completely impossible and sets quite a high bar for people who complain that they can't do it, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point. I didn't even know that quote, which now I'm going to memorize. Let's do the impossible. I mean, not only did he run a big band with dancers and everything else, the sets and the costumes that he moved around the world, he was doing highly experimental work and doing that. I mean, not to say that being a pop band that size, and that's already quite an accomplishment
Yeah.
anyway. But like to have a big band doing totally original music, pushing the envelope from the standpoint of exploring what music can be, what's impossible, what's possible. I mean, it wasn't a commercial endeavor, and he made it work. That's unbelievable. I mean, who's doing that now?
Yeah.
So.
And I think it kind of leads into the second question, which has been the hardest one for me to answer and the hardest one so far for everybody to kind of deal with, because we can't know. I mean, there is no answer to this. But if the first part of the question is, how did Sun Ra affect culture? American culture specifically, definitely a case can be made for global culture now. But how do you think the context in which he grew up in, and you've already kind of entered this stream, but the context in which he grew up in Alabama, in Chicago, and Philadelphia, how do you think that created the person? I mean, this is something I've wondered about a lot of artists and musicians that just seem to have found something that came out of nowhere and will never be repeated. We're not going to have, no one is going to come out of the ground being like Sun Ra. No one's going to come out of the ground being like Harry Partch. Where do they come from? And in both cases, they're dealing with a context in which they are not part of the hegemony of American society, to put it very, very politely. How do you think, and again, like understanding that this is absolute conjecture, how do you think those elements created the work that Sun Ra put together to be Sun Ra? I mean, his work is him as a person. How do you think that affected what he was doing?
That's another very difficult question.
I only ask difficult questions.
I think
Impossible, John. Go ahead.
it's impossible. I got to give it a try. I think in the case of Ra, I mean, let's say you'd have two basic ways of going about looking at trying to interpret somebody's work, right? You could, on the one hand, you can go the route of looking at biography and contextualizing it within a whole set of biographical, his education, his upbringing, his surroundings, the racism he had faced in his hometown, his escape from that, the period on the road, all of those kinds of things, right? And then and his education as a band leader, all of those kinds of things. And that explains part of it. Those are all, I think, part of the constellation of things that you have to take into consideration for him as a person in 1950 to sort of say, I don't want to be known as Herman Poole Blunt anymore. I don't feel comfortable with that name anymore. And maybe I never did. So I'm going to be known as Lasonia Ra or Sun Ra. And that's not really a stage name. It's a name that he takes on, right? He completely changes his name. But the other side of it, that's all this biographical stuff that you can use to kind of chart where he is. The other side of it is, I don't think you can absolutely nail him that way, because there's lots of people who came up with those same circumstances that he did who didn't do what he did. And I'm not a believer in genius in the kind of strictest sense at all. But in his case, in the case of certain people, I think they tap into a wavelength that allows them to get outside of a lot of the things that are going on and see things with an insane perspective, like an unbelievable perspective, a really kaleidoscopic and panoramic perspective. And he's one of those people who I think you can't explain it all by means of biography or any of the, or even looking at it in a linear way. He wasn't interested in those linear developments. He was interested in foiling all of those linear developments. So even in terms of his own work, he would present things that were very old with things that were much newer, things that were kind of corny together with things that were really radical. he started playing, went back to playing the songbooks of Henderson and Ellington at a time when that was not, fashionable to do. And he did it, because that was the music that turned him on, and that was the music that he felt was relevant at that point. So all of those things, those come from a place that's very difficult to put your finger on, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with John on that. I mean, he created a whole universe. I mean, literally, and that is beyond like just social context, biographical context. The history leading up to that point, history that gets changed by his presence in it. It's hard to imagine. I mean, you could piece out like, okay, he started studying, African American history, African histories, at a time where that was like, pretty new, and finding out information that wasn't readily available, studying philosophy. I mean, like he was an unbelievable student of ideas. And okay, you could say, well, that impacts, like, okay, if my context is so horrific and there's no way for me to overcome it with the tools at my disposal, I create a whole new context, and that's where I am. And I bring the people with me who want to be in that context, and that's where we're going to live, because what's around us doesn't make any sense. So he creates a context that does have sense and meaning and presence, and creates all of this stuff around that. To make that jump, as John says, like there were hundreds of thousands of people, millions, in a context that was similar to his, with similar kinds of backgrounds, similar kinds of education, let's say, who didn't do that. I mean, you can look at the Parliament Funkadelic thing, and like, the space of the place and the mothership can, I mean, there's reasons that you leave this planet if the conditions of this planet are a horror show for you and everybody you know. So you can now that model exists, we can say, well, yeah, that makes sense, and it's got all these reasons that it works. It gets people interested in what you're doing artistically. I mean, you can rationalize it by looking back at it, but he did it. I mean, he created that other universe, and like how you make that jump emotionally, intellectually, intuitively, to John's point, I mean, I don't know where the biography is that creates that ability, because if it did, it would happen a lot more often. There would be a lot more people making similar kinds of leaps. And there are many people doing amazing things. But on a level like that, like a whole nother paradigm with such deep levels to it, I mean, how many people? Like, we're talking like a couple handfuls in a century? I don't know, if you look at it. So I think there's something very, very, very powerful in Ra's work that creates the ability for others to do the impossible, let's say, to put it to that, to create like a way of, it's not just that he's right. He made this amazing thing, and it's beyond genius in a sense. But it's also another model, like the mothership. Let's get out of here. It's a model of thinking that has power. And when you start having those models, like for me, the model of DIY that Ra illustrates for me, I mean, that gives me something to hold on to. It's not like conjecture on my part. Someone already did the impossible. Well, hey, maybe I can do that too, in my own way. That's guided by my own biography and my own situation. So the power in that transcends Ra's own work, I think. It's bigger than Sun Ra, and that's part of what's so marvelous about it. It's like an example for how to approach a life in this place that we're in. And that's beyond biography, And now it's part of history. It's part of our shared history. Mm-hmm.
And it's, I think the other thing, it's important to understand Ra in relation to a whole bunch of social and intellectual currents of that time, right? And conversations that were going on. But he purposefully isolated himself from a lot of those conversations, right? He didn't want to be seen as someone who was in dialogue, like direct dialogue with Nation of Islam, let's say, early on, right? Even though a lot of what he's doing is having conversations with them, with that. It was also done in an indirect way and also done in an isolated way. And all of his work in some ways was about that notion of, going to another planet was the idea. He says it right at the beginning of Space is the Place, right? Let's imagine, what would it be like if we teletransported ourselves to another planet where there were no white people? Mm-hmm. Let's see what kind of beauty we can have there that we can't have here. I mean, that is about a certain kind of, that's beyond nationalism, right? That's beyond separatism. That's a kind of isolation. And I think that's important to remember in terms of his, he came up, he had great teachers. He had inspiring teachers. He had all sorts of people. And without them, one can imagine he may not have been able to get to the place that he got. But once he hit that place and discovered for himself, which must have happened very early, he was a conscientious objector in a period where that was really weird, and he had to be in jail for a period of time in order to be a conscientious objector, because he didn't believe in killing people. And so, you're already setting yourself apart, and showing people that you have your own set of principles in the world. And I think he went on to do that with all of his work. He was a principled guy in terms of his work. He just went forward, did it, and the notion was, I'm going to do it. I'm going to bring all my people together. We're going to live together so we can create as a unit constantly. I mean, that's one of the most towering examples of do it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, it almost seems like it's an issue of form and content. Like Sun Ra is going to be Sun Ra no matter what. If he had grown up in Bern, Switzerland in 1884, the content would have been different, but it still would have been some version of that kind of greatness. It's just that the time he grew up in ended up being funneled to a certain extent through the person into creating what it is that we recognize as his music, his way of being, do you think that is a possibility, or do you think that really this is just something, there's a germ of an idea in a human being, regardless, growing up in a vacuum, he still would come out Sun Ra completely?
No, I think it was very specific to the African-American experience.
Yeah.
I think for him, it was very much predicated on the question of this extraordinary, awful situation of a whole, group of people being brought into America, their histories obliterated, their identities homogenized. This is the brutality of Middle Passage. Then, for him, it became the foundation for a lifetime of imagining creative responses to that, and imagining confounding responses to that. So that it was, and I don't think that would have happened. I think that's very specific to this. In Bern, he might have had different set of foundational mythologies that he was working with, but that was specifically his. And I think it's one that, like Ken said, it's in some ways it hasn't changed very much in 50, 60 years. And so the things that we can learn from Ra continue to be relevant today for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why his legacy has grown, in the time since he passed. To your point earlier, John, that, it's the last, 15 whatever plus years. He's more, he's accomplished more since his passing, in a sense, because part of the issue is that things haven't changed.
Yeah.
So his alternate universe, so to speak, has tons of meaning now because the conditions that created the impulse to discover that and make that and create it on so many levels still exist horribly.
Yeah.
So the meaning is, it's not like, well, that was an anomaly in the past. It's like what he's saying, what he said throughout his lifetime is still speaking to us, because the conditions that help motivate that thinking still exist for us, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at parallels. I agree. I do think that I think Kafka, for instance, there's a parallel, right?
Yeah.
The notion of a minor literature, not in the sense of being lesser, but in the sense of being carved out minoritarian literature within the majority literature that has a very special place, that has this also that kicks against it in a certain respect. And so that, I think there's a parallel there. We can find all sorts of parallels historically and probably in a contemporary setting as well. So there are parallels, but they're all very specific to the moment in which they come up. So they may not be biographical. They may be also, historical. You have to look at them from multiple standpoints, but they're not reducible. I mean, part of the genius, or part of I go to that word because it's hard to think of other words to use to talk about Ra, but part of what Ra brought to the table was brand new ways of thinking about things, and thinking about things in contrary ways, trying not to think in a cookie cutter way, but really trying to push away from standard ways of thinking, both in terms of music and also in terms of how you live your life. He had a big thing about choose life, not death, right? This whole concept of not acceding to the inevitability of death. Although one of my favorite quotes of his is the quote where he's talking about the fact that one thing common to all humankind is that the proclamation still stands: everyone must go, everyone must die. And so he was also a guy of contradictions, and he lived those contradictions and understood them and embraced them in interesting ways. But I think it's hard you start diving into the world of Ra and you start getting there's so much there. It's so rich. I mean, Ken, musically, right? It's just to be thinking across the board. When you say Sun Ra, you don't mean one thing. Like Ellington, you mean many, many things.
Yeah, I mean, and many, many things simultaneously. Like you said, later in his career, he's bringing the Fletcher Henderson charts out and playing them with the band in a raw way, but pretty straightforward. It's Fletcher Henderson's tune. They're playing the changes on it, while also doing like totally textural, new technology synthesizer work in the same set. So like he's many, many, many things musically, and also pulled in layers on top of each other. So it's like the history gets thrown into contrary situations as well through the music. So there's like all kinds of stuff going on there. Ra isn't one thing, to put it mildly, including the music. The music is not of a thing. It changes, it develops, it shifts all over the place. It overlaps on itself with total impact, and it's so effective. I mean, that's part of it that I'm fascinated by, is like to the point of running a large band, a big band, when that was frankly impossible. Maintaining it, paying people, the way he got people to shows, like the spectacle, like is a genuine interest of his. The costumes, the mythology, that's all legitimate. It's not just quote unquote a show, but at the same time, it's ingenious maintaining that, like dragging those costumes around the world. Like, what a pain in the ass. But when the show happens, it's the show, and he knows too that that brings people in. Just like Ellington knew that doing the greatest hits medley, which I'm sure the band really never, ever, ever wanted to do ever again. He knew there were people that came to the show because they wanted to hear, Take the A Train for the 3 millionth time. And I think on some level, Ra knew that this spectacle also drove people to see the shows who may not want to hear his synthesizer textures, but would bring them to the show, which meant the band would get paid, which meant he could continue to do his work.
Yeah.
So I think there's like a lot of layers going on there too, with the mythology and the layers of things involved in his presentation of his music that was true to his vision and also true to the reality of how do you make a band work economically. And that's like, I mean, what is accomplished there, once I start talking about it, I just become flabbergasted all over again. It's like such a deep accomplishment.
Hey, can I share with, I know we're coming up on the end of talking here, but I pulled out one really cool artifact. Since this is visual, I thought I could show one super cool thing. Ra played in a band called Morris Ellis and his Swing Masters. Must have been in the early 1950s. And I found a flyer for this band. Wow. Which is a kind of awesome band. Here they are. That's their vehicle.
I love it.
Totally amazing.
Wow.
I was actually in that photograph, but I'll show you. Here's the amazing. So the flyer looks like this.
Whoa.
And right down there is Mr. Blunt.
Wow. Oh, man.
Isn't that amazing?
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's incredible. Thanks for joining us, you guys. It's been a real honor. I hope that I can see you in person, both sometime soon, and we can play music or listen to music or talk about music or talk about anything else. So thanks a lot, and stay tuned. Thanks to John and Ken, and more coming soon.
Thanks. Congratulations.
Thank you, Nate. For this evening, I've chosen to read from a manuscript that I'm preparing for publication later this year. My cover artist will be Khalid Thompson, great painter based here in the Washington, D.C. area. And the title of the book is Ghost Dancing with Khepra. This section is entitled Before the Flood. There is a spot at the top of your head, under your scalp. Plates of your skull come together there, and the seams between the plates are like three wavy lines, three sutures. Where they meet is the anterior fontanelle, big and open enough when you were born to see the blood pulsing beneath the skin. Now it is really just a pore, a tiny opening left in the top of your cranium. There I have been watching you in darkness and silence since before either of us were born. You have been watching me too, looking down and through my head, staring through the two hemispheres of my brain, and into the special well in the center with its single organ dangling in this space, which is always dark. Silver threads are branching out from this aperture in everyone's head. These fibers glow and glisten with a cool blue light. Follow the thread into and through each brain, and you will be surprised to see the thread passing down the spine, bulging a bit around your heart, before running down the center of your back and terminating in the cradle of your pelvis, in the cauda equinis. Follow the thread out and away from the crown of your head, and you will quickly experience your thread reaching for, meeting, and connecting with all the other threads, sharing their current and their glow. You will see how these fibers become a tangled mycelium-like mat. You will, when you see this matted web of illuminated threads, be almost overwhelmed by the beauty and density of our interconnections. You will be baffled that you had never noticed this wondrous web. You will feel challenged and maybe angry, maybe just confused when I insist that you must own your thread, its terminus in your coccyx, its infinitely complex glowing associations with all the other threads, and that your ownership of this network is an essential part of your development, an indispensable dimension of your coming politics, a key to your corporeal and spiritual survival. This book, if it can be called that, was written for Black people. I am writing at a time when race and our explosive engagement with its dialectic are but one glaring hint that we have all slipped off the rails of development and have allowed our destiny to become mired in a retrograde timeline, a vague facsimile of history and its progression. The daily news, with all its shock and scintillation, is a stale succession of repeated experiences. Time's spasmodic bowels are clenching and churning, and the unspeakable filth that flows out of this irritated temporal tube is marked as new and recycled through the inverted shadow of progress. There is a clock in the public square that was fashioned with little regard to the cyclical flow of seasons. Not the annual seasons dictated by our passage around the sun, not the larger cycles marked by our transit through the celestial zodiac, nor the much larger cycles that have something remarkable to do with the quality and strength of our shared interconnectivity. This clock was put there as a distractor of mammoth proportions. It is not just colored white. The clock and its time are the essence of whiteness. We, almost all of us now on this planet, stand beneath this ivory temporal tower transfixed by its ticks, frozen in place by its tocks, staring up at its height, our mouths agape like little birdies, while an alien hand, attached to no body, shoves the filthy diarrhea of his story past our lips and down our throats. We are all victimized by this clock and its hypnotic rhythms. We are all made infirm by this slow-mo diet of monotony and filth. I started watching you through the top of your skull only when I realized that I could choose not to look at this white clock. I am still struggling, even as I write this prescriptive text, with rescuing the rhythm of my own breathing from the powerful entrainment of this diabolical clock and its rhythmic bleach. I am, now that I am no longer looking at that clock, shocked to discover how many white people there actually are, billions more than can be measured by mere skin color. White versus black is the lingual color of our race war, a cold war mostly, but a war nonetheless. And yet I am discovering in the second half of my life that the relationship to this alien clock is a much more reliable measure of whiteness than skin color, language, or culture. Those who feel no discomfort in the spectacle of the clock tower and its mass hypnosis, those who have never been compelled to close their mouths and turn away, are the whitest of them all, regardless of how they are marked by any binary code of society's race talk, or the genetic code that scripts epidermal hue. Light is essential. So is the dark. Seeds germinate in the black bosom of fertile soil. Infants are conceived and come to term in the pitch black wet of a female womb. The value of blackness is self-evident if under-recognized. And now we have reached a moment when we must turn off the lights on the broadest scale possible if we are to birth our new selves out of the enslavement to white power, white time, and a white light so blindingly bright that it permits no illumination at all. Rivers and railroads mark out a journey. Trains travel across ribbons of steel, pulling people and products from one point to another. Rivers are the natural interaction of land, water, and gravity on a planet with much more moisture in its atmosphere and ground than many. Civil engineers fight with gravity as they try to keep the moving train and its mass on the shallowest grades possible as they plot its path between destinations. The heavy locomotive and the cars it propels will polish the metal rails, buff them to a mirror-like glaze as the miles of tightly controlled motion are clocked. The river will also tell the story of its journey through the brazen effects of friction. It will cut deep channels first, then canyons, as it meanders, neither delayed nor rushed, to the sea. We live in a world fashioned by human minds. Like a railroad, this world was designed to transit space and time, to move objects and personalities between nodes of a dispersed network. Like the train, our lives in this human fabricated world only make sense when subordinated to the gleaming alabaster clock tower at the center of civilization. We will not arrive at our destination on a train. This entire thing can only deliver us to an acceptable, survivable destiny if we were to see it transform from the image of a train system to a form that resembles a network of rivers, a system of transit and exchange not bound to the finite tracks of a railroad, but dispersed organically among shifting floodplains and emerging, merging, and disappearing tributaries, structured in its intricacies by nothing more authoritarian or irresistible than gravity. This is an entirely different kind of civilization than we live in today, which is generous in allowing that this might be a civilization at all. In America, the trains run on time. Blackness is a way of knowing America, its many trains, and their time. It is a secret society of knowing, not belief. Sun Ra emphasized the Middle Passage as a transmutation. Indeed, the wholesale monetization of human lives represented by 4 centuries of a global system founded on millions of stolen black bodies is an unprecedented, cosmically scaled, earthbound event. It is the social equivalent of an atomic bomb and equally a point of no return. Slavery in America was miserable. It was a life sentence of hard labor as punishment for the crime of being born black within the reach of white people. It was a life sentence of confiscated time punctuated by violence and demeaning abuse. It was also a perspective of observation that was both deeply interior and fundamentally exterior to the American condition. This New World slave, the black chattel created with capitalism's first gulps of breath, was an experimental technology. As historically ancient as slavery may or may not have been, never before had money been unleashed on a class of human beings with the intent of annihilating their reality as men and women. We didn't come here as immigrants, Sun Ra reminds us, but as cargo, items of commerce. We were baptized by the waters of the Atlantic into a new order of being, a proto-post-human, that is, human being transformed beyond humanity by its collision with modernity in the form of organized capital. This is an advanced state of existence. This perspective of observation, this occult knowledge about train schedules is our inheritance. It is our real soul food. Now, to be clear, what is wonderful about all those threads flowing in and out of all of our skulls is that they are all of exactly the same diameter, length, and luminosity. The world of fontanelle penetrating threads is egalitarian in a quantum way. No black threads, yellow threads, red threads, or white threads. No rich or poor, male, female, cis, or queer threads. Just threads. All silvery blue. But these threads are connected to us and they touch our knowledge. Since the beginning of the Western world's experimental monetization of black life, this soul food has been a part of what we feed into the network. It is our unwilled and uncompensated contribution to the global energy by means of which human history unfolds as mythic play. And truly it makes our black light a little bit radioactive, that is, constitutionally destructive, potentially mutagenic. Especially when we consider that this knowledge about America that is housed in historical blackness is largely occult, even to ourselves. This knowledge had to be buried, masked, submerged in collective subconscious as we made or were forced to make a series of pragmatic choices about our political self-determination. It did not go away, and because it was knowledge, not belief, it could not be refuted or contradicted. It is just there, only occasionally within reach of articulation, not mute, but vibrating, humming beneath and between us. A part of everyone's story is black now, if only because America is running a train on the world, and that fact is the most poorly hidden secret in history. Space is the place. All real estate is contested. Thank you, and thank you for supporting my work. And thank you for reading Essay 24.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Nate Wooley with Luke Stewart and Thomas Stanley. We're here celebrating the release of Sound American 24, the Sun Ra issue. You can read the issue now. It's online for free at soundamerican.org. It will live online for free forever. If you want to support Sound American, the best thing to do is to purchase a print copy or a print subscription. You can do that at soundamerican.org or on our Bandcamp page. I also want to bring your attention to a $10 suggested donation for tonight's event. All the money that's raised through those donations are going to go to Nation Inside's Justice for Family project. This is a bipartisan project that aims to reallocate government funding that has gone traditionally toward mass incarceration and instead use that funding for programs for families and communities. All of that money will go directly to the foundation. If you prefer to not have it go through Sound American's hands, I'm also going to put the link in the comments for you to donate directly, and I happily will have you do that instead. I'm here now with Thomas Stanley and Luke Stewart. They had an incredible central conversation to this issue based on Thomas's book, The Execution of Sun Ra, Volume 2. This is a book that Luke gave me actually when I played Rhizome a couple of years ago. I love it. I've given it to family members to read. And when we decided to do the Sun Ra issue, I was really excited when Luke brought up the possibility of having a conversation with Thomas about the book. And I'm really happy that they're both here tonight to join us as well. Luke is a new member of the editorial board for Sound American. We're really happy to have him. This is his first time contributing to the journal. This is Thomas's first time contributing to the journal. I hope it won't be their last. But I'm very excited to have them here. I'm going to just jump straight into questions. I've been kind of asking all of the contributors tonight roughly the same questions, but kind of in different ways depending on their experience and the things that they contributed to the journal. And I want to start and frame the question to the two of you by quoting this sentence from Luke's introduction to the piece, which I really liked. I was reading again this morning. It says, more than a reflection of his life and work, the execution of Sun Ra, as Thomas's book, is a call to the 21st century, the century of Sun Ra, for abrupt change in mental and physical being for all humanity. And I think that kind of opens up beautifully into this first question I've been asking everybody, which is, Sun Ra was such an iconic figure and continues to be such an iconic figure, not only because of his music, but because of his thought, because of his presence. He's a figure in the art world. He's a cultural icon, a visual icon now. You know, the number of T-shirts you see with Sun Ra's picture on them speaks volumes. What do you think, and I think maybe we'll start with Thomas because he had the closest relationship with Sun Ra as a person and has done a ton of research. What do you think the lasting impact of Sun Ra as an individual being has been on American culture and American society, artistic, political, humanistic culture. You speak about it a little bit in the conversation, but I wonder if you could go into what you think his impact has been.
Well, good morning, Nate, and good morning, Luke. We're taping this in the morning, a week before you folks are digesting it. Sun Ra was a time bomb. Sun Ra was a thing that when it blows up creates new time to create a new version of history within. And that's a really tall order for a humble jazz musician out of Birmingham, Alabama. I don't think you can say it any more clearly than that. I think we have been directed by Sun Ra, pointed in the direction of a massive change, which if we accept the responsibilities and imperative of that change, will put us in a much better place as beings, as humans or whatever we become, than we've ever been before.
That's incredible. Luke, to move to you, what, for a generation removed, and as you say, this is talking about Sun Ra in the 21st century, what is the impact you think on your generation, one that maybe never even was able to see Sun Ra live and has been dealing more with the ghost band, the history, the way the myth might be built in different ways now that he's gone?
Yeah, I can say that, you can hear me, right? Yeah, I can say that for me, perhaps not necessarily as representative of my generation, but in observing my generation, you can see that, you can really see his impact, and you can see the influence that his music and his legacies have put forth with like you said, the cultural conversation he's entered into around things like Afrofuturism and different science fiction or futurist looking cultures, and applying that to current conditions and to current cultural waves, so to speak. I myself, as an artist, am obviously deeply influenced by the work of Sun Ra and by the message of Sun Ra, by really just listening to his words, and in examining his work and his trajectory, his timeline, his time here on this planet. It's you can see how there are various stages of obscurity where there was a generation in, say, Thomas's generation, by and large, may have missed him. And it's only after his death that you have a generation that can really analyze and really receive the full message of his work in a post life sort of situation. Obviously, people like Marshall Allen have been truly iconicized as the working leader of the band. I've seen them. I've probably seen the orchestra more than any other band.
We opened for them
live.
We opened for them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We've opened for them. I've played several bills with them. Like I said, it's probably the group that I've seen the most live, and I think that that's also a testament to their popularity and to their influence on this generation, being able to go on world tours, and people are hungry for this music, hungry for that energy, for that Sun Ra energy, whatever that means to them. to people around the world, and it is younger people, people that probably didn't get a chance to, probably either weren't alive or didn't get a chance to get Sun Ra when he was alive. So I think that's a very important element of it as well, because it's trying to reach this very powerful energy that isn't here anymore, but has been made all the more powerful by his physical presence not being here. So his influence is very, very important for this generation.
And what do you think that is? Because I agree, not why is it important for this generation, but I agree that this is something that people are looking for, that energy, that's specific. And I've opened for the orchestra here in New York once as well, and was completely blown away by the amount of energy that could be packed into a room, like positive energy, and I've been in places where there's been energy, but I couldn't always just say this is 110% positivity, kind of beautiful stuff. Where is that? How come? Is it just because Sun Ra was this particular person? Is it because he passed that legacy down to Marshall Allen, who, should be canonized in the same way for his energy? Is that just luck of the draw of having those people together? Or is there something else from the historical impact of it, from America in that time, or just from Ra being who he was, that brought that energy about that we just don't have today? And how do we find it? Can we find it again? Or is it only going to exist in this particular circumstance?
Yeah.
So,
Well,
go ahead.
I think that when you look at Sun Ra and his popularity today, it's, yes, you have to take into account the potency of his message, the potency of his music, and his legacy is undeniable. It's as Thomas has written about, as many other people have stated, there are more Sun Ra recording. He's probably one of, if not the most, he's probably the most recorded person in American music. There's more that hasn't been listened to than has been, and that's a fact that has been, when Thomas and I visited the house, that was one of the things that Marshall said to us. Just the vast amount of work that has been released. So artistically, philosophically, energetically, all those things, it's very clear that Sun Ra is one of the most important American thinkers, musicians to ever live. But it's difficult also to analyze his impact without taking into account the industry machine that makes things have impact in this society, right? So at the same time, and also just charting the history of what has happened in the orchestra itself, okay? So you have to think about, yes, they've capitalized on the great and very, very over-deserved, like deeply deserved opportunities, if not deserving of more opportunities, to perform live, to be interviewed, and to be really part of this festival circuit. And you have people like Red Bull interviewing Marshall Allen a lot of articles being written about the orchestra and about Marshall in particular, and trying to sell that Sun Ra story. And more than ever before, Thomas, you please correct me if I'm wrong, but more than ever before, Sun Ra exists in the mainstream music industry.
Let me tell you something.
Yes.
It's difficult to assess Sun Ra's impact because the impact is ongoing. The pandemic is ongoing. The petty dictatorship at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is ongoing. The race war in the streets is ongoing. Sun Ra's idea, Sun Ra's life was magical. And the magic was about human development and the forward progress of what we have previously thought of as history. That story is ending. These are the final chapters, and we should really, I mean this quite seriously. This is something I'm giving you as to assist you in your life. As you breathe, take in that holy breath. As it comes in, as it goes out, be thankful that you're living right now. Don't be afraid. Don't be anxious. Don't be all angry. Be thankful that you're living right now, because the changes that we're going to see are incredibly beautiful in large part. You know, any birth, there's some pain involved. Any woman will tell you that it's been through natural childbirth. There's some pain involved. But an entirely new world is being birthed right before our eyes. Sun Ra told me years ago, he said, you know, when the first thing that happens when somebody loses a war, they take their flag down. They take their flag down. And Sonny said, that war's not over. Their flag is all over the place. At the time he spoke, it was in multiple southern states as part of their state flags. So now we see the statues coming down. We see the flags coming down. We see the whole social fabric turned off because of a little strip of code that is wearing our asses out, a little strip of nucleic acid that is perfectly designed for just this kind of effect. 40% of the people are asymptomatic carriers, and a small portion will die suffering in the most really ugly sort of way. Now, that's been thrown into the mix along with this guy with the hair, along with, you know, what was it about George Floyd? I mean, forgive me, but I've seen a lot of black men have their lives snuffed out on television by law enforcement. What was so particular about that death and that little clip of video that it caught the attention of the entire world and has pushed us in the direction of these great changes? It's not over yet. It's not over yet. Buckle up, you know, get you whatever you've got for safety gear, get it together, and we're going to rock and roll through this. And where we land is what Sun Ra called Alter Destiny, and it's a warless, stateless, moneyless, rapeless, racismless, homophobia-less place. Sounds like a utopia. We needed a word that would allow us to speak as utopians, because the human nature is essentially utopian. We would all like to live as family in a post-racial world, but we don't have language to articulate the possibility of it. Somebody gave us a set of words, and they talked about universal history and class struggle, and we tried that, and it fell apart. See, I don't know if either of you gentlemen can remember how quickly the Soviet Union went from being a mighty world power to a failed state whose ideology had been completely thrown on the trash heap of history. If you don't think that's what's happening with the United States right now, then I don't know what newspapers you're reading. I don't know what internet you're looking at. These are huge changes, and they're difficult, but they're good changes, changes for our children. You know, Luke and I are both fathers of black boys, and we are both determined that the world that they enter as adults will not be the world where they have any risk of going out like George Floyd and the countless other people that have been murdered by American imperialism. Yeah, Sun Ra can't assess his impact because that impact is ongoing. Sun Ra was special because he was magical.
Yeah, I think it's a really good place for us to not end this conversation, but for us to kind of release this event and hopefully ideas, especially the ideas that you just brought up and the ideas that Luke brought up a little bit earlier, go out into the world and hopefully spawn more discussion and more action, and whether that's around Sun Ra or around anything else. I think it's just a very good place for us to not stop the conversation, but to release it out into the world. So I want to thank both of you, Thomas Stanley and Luke Stewart, for being here tonight, not only for your performance and your reading, but the writing in the issue. It's one of the ones that I read a couple times when I edited and have read a couple times since, just for my own pleasure. So I want to thank you personally for that. This is going to be the end of the presentation. So there will be links. Again, please donate to Nation Inside's Justice for Families. I'll give that link in the comments. Please feel free to stop by Sound American and read this article and the others, and to purchase a print copy if you want to support Sound American. Thomas and Luke, thank you again so much for being here. And I look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully sometime in the near future.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.